In our final conversation today, we're going to be tackling the broader issue of striking a balance between the need to build a savings pool over the longer term on the one hand, and then feeding the shorter term revenue demands of the fiscus on the other. I caught up with Commissioner of the South African Revenue Service, Edward Kieswetter, and pretty apt, right, given his previous stint having turned Alexander Forbes around. But I started off by asking him whether he's convinced that the change in leadership in government and the commitment to fiscal prudence and to tackling South Africa's dysfunctional state-owned enterprises are promising developments in the battle to improve the country's savings rate. So, Edward, I came across some market commentary saying that the change in leadership in government, the commitment to fiscal prudence, the commitment to tackling South Africa's dysfunctional state-owned enterprises as well are promising developments in the battle to improve the country's savings rate. Are you convinced?
Well, I think directionally, what has happened since the elections last year, particularly in the body politic around the government of national unity, bringing all the parties together, certainly has created a positive dynamic that I, as I'm sure 62 million others, are hoping works. Because that has drawn a positive sentiment. It's given a clear statement to the world that actually, in relative terms, our politics is fairly mature. If you think that we put this government together in just short of a month, whereas in more mature democracies, they've taken more than a year in some cases to put a government together post an election where there isn't an outright winner. So I think directionally and sentimentally, that's good. What we saw in the electricity challenge that we faced, the dreaded load shedding, and therefore us sitting in the dark, literally and figuratively, there's an important lesson coming out of that, which is that partnerships between government and business not only works, but it is necessary. Government does not have all the capacity, the capability, or the know-how. In fact, it's not their role often. Their role is to create an enabling environment and then let people who know get on with the work. And that's exactly what happened in the solving the electricity issue, was when we began to not try to fix Eskom only, but fix the entire sector, put in place the enabling legislation, brought down some of the restrictive regulations and crowded in both residents and businesses to become more self-reliant. And that has given us this reprieve that we're currently experiencing, whilst we are still continuing to fix the foundational aspects of Eskom and unbundle it into its three components.
Yeah.
So all of those are positive foundations, but we have a long way to go. So South Africa still is too indebted at the level of households. And not only are they indebted, they are indebted in the worst possible form, in expensive debt. If I just look at credit card debt, which is expensive debt, how many households are living basically on credit card debt and paying, sometimes paying other forms of borrowing with a credit card just makes the whole lot bigger. And then you balance that with a relatively poor savings culture and a relatively weak compulsory savings framework. So I think that directionally we have begun to make the right moves. I think the two-pot withdrawal is somehow a compromise, not quite the gold standard that we need to go for, but it's a helpful compromise, which in our case balances the need for long-term savings with reality that many people are struggling today.
Absolutely, but that's in a context where we have growth slow to no growth, right? A stagnant economy. We've had the BER's economic modelling suggest that South Africa could achieve 3.3% real GDP growth in 2025. A lot of that hinging on the implementation of a reform agenda. Stagnant to 3.3% growth by year end. Are you convinced? Are you even convinced by Treasury's upside scenario of what I think it's sitting at 2% right now?
I think that if we look at the enablers for growth, because you can't say we will have X% growth without asking where will that growth come from. And of course, if you look at the improvement in Eskom, some of it has ironically come about because of the slow economic growth and therefore the lower demand for electricity, then supplemented by rooftop solars, have meant that we had the bigger reprieve and not the load shedding in part to where we are. So the good news in Eskom is actually not good news for the economy. But from a positive perspective, there is a higher level of self-reliance, and therefore Eskom need not be as much as a disabler for growth as it was in the load shedding days. And so we shouldn't mask that. And we see that actually from a tax perspective, in small and medium businesses are actually doing a little bit better than what we expected, whilst the larger businesses are still, in some of the sectors, particularly mining, are still struggling. So the second area as an enabler for growth is the logistics sector. I am not convinced that we can have the kind of growth that we wish for if we don't achieve the same level of reliability in the logistics sector as we now have achieved in the electricity sector. Because just the logistics is a huge multiplier. If mines stop producing because they cannot get product from the mines to the ports because of an unreliable freight system, or a road system that takes time and consumes cost, adds to the cost of doing business, and our ports are not efficient and operating at a world-class level, then we will always have a deep structural debilitating constraint for growth. And then thirdly, if we are not creating new businesses and jobs, more than what we lose jobs, then you do not have sustainable foundation for ongoing growth. And so therefore we wish for the higher growth, but we still need to take the hard decisions that will enable that growth.
Absolutely, because look, like I said, sustainable growth is what we're after. And I said at the top, it's key to building that saving rate just as integral as growing revenue for SARS to draw on. If we have to, move away from an aid funding-based measure model to self-reliance and effective domestic resource mobilization, right? So talk us through SARS' new 5-year plan and how you're, within this context that you've just outlined, looking to mobilize domestic resources.
So, of course, all of those factors that constrains growth also constrains, if all other things were equal, the growth in the tax register and therefore the growth in tax revenue. So there's a direct correlation between what happens in the economy to what happens in the tax base and ultimately to the potential revenue that must be collected by the state. But that correlation is not a perfect correlation because there's something called domestic resource mobilization. And what domestic resource mobilization refers to is the ability of government to harvest the revenue that is already due to it because of its various policy instruments in place. And in our case, we know that we are under-recovering. How do we know that? We know that because every theoretical modeling or determination of a so-called tax gap tells us that we are under-collecting the revenue that is due to the fiscus. The current numbers is round about 450, 460 billion rand. And then we add to that our own balance sheet, which has two huge components on it that represents money for the fiscus. The first is debt that is not under dispute. In other words, taxpayers are not saying they don't owe us the debt, they just don't have the means to pay. And secondly is outstanding returns. And if we add that together, we add another 300 plus billion of under-collected revenue. So if we add that, you may have heard us in previous sessions in Parliament report an under-collection of between 7 and 800 billion rand. And so that is where the modernization of SARS and the appropriate investment in the fiscus comes to play. Why is this important to other people other than me, whose job it is to collect this revenue? Because if we build a credible, efficient, and effective revenue administration that can close the gap between expenditure and revenue and reduce the fact that every 20 cents of revenue that we collect actually does nothing other than keeping the wolves away from the door. It doesn't even redeem the debt. It just services the debt cost. And you have to begin to knock that number down to get into a more virtuous cycle. It's like when you have a bond unit to your house and your repayment is 15,000 rand. Every 1,000 rand you can pay more, actually you can see with great delight how the capital reduces and overall your payment reduces and you have more money for disposable expenditure. Governments are no different. And the money for disposable expenditure is reduced by the fact that we have a debt burden that's not sustainable. And why this matters to every South African to comply and to help me do my job and not get fired is because it reduces the temptation to hike or increase tax rates to improve revenue.
Yeah.
And so we have been a strong proponent, publicly and privately, to say an appropriate investment in SARS will ensure that SARS can more effectively administer its mandate, therefore collect some of the under-recovered revenue and achieve a stronger, more sustainable fiscal integrity for South Africa. And overall, allows government to then invest in enabling technology, enabling infrastructure without having to increase the debt burden and keep us in this negative spiral. So a well-functioning revenue authority is actually integral to sustainable economic growth, to creating more jobs, and to all of us ultimately getting the desired economic growth that we spoke about earlier.
Yeah. Bottom line, as you say, better tax policy administration, which is what you're in charge of, has the ability to help governments achieve their objectives at the end of the day. I've got to ask, in South Africa's case, though, how aligned is policy to those objectives? Because it's one thing you improving revenue collection from an administration perspective, another thing to have policy actually supporting your endeavors.
Policy has been very supportive. Successive ministers of finance have given a clear messaging that it's a very to be very circumspect before increasing. The last big hike we had on big taxes was the VAT from 14 to 15%. And we know from experience that that did not radically give more revenue because you've reached a point of inflection. And so, true to a policy direction already set by the former ministers of finance, we have actually started trending down, for example, corporate income tax rates, with an intention to do more, but the quid pro quo is to broaden the base, improve compliance, reduce the opportunity for companies to arbitrage their rate. There's something called the statutory rate and the effective rate. And if the gap between the statutory and effective rate is too big, there's something wrong with the system. But to their credit, all of the ministers of finance have held that line. That doesn't mean a minister of finance will never look at increasing a tax rate or tax policy because it is one of the legitimate instruments at their disposal. But I think what is clear that directionally the biggest benefit for South Africa to improve its domestic resource mobilization and thus its financial integrity is a better tax administrator.
Yeah, I want to home in on a few policy reforms that have been coming through, impacting the investment landscape, impacting the asset management industry specifically, bearing in mind who our audience is today, right? At a very broad level first, are we striking the balance between the need, Commissioner, to build a savings pool over the longer term and then meeting the shorter term revenue demands of the fiscus?
Well, you can never say you're doing enough. And as long as we are where we are, we certainly can't declare a victory. So if you go back to the two-pot system, which I said is a compromise that balances the future burden on the fiscus by a growing social wage, which is unsustainable. We can't continue to pay more social grants and more and more people depending on the fiscus. We have to reduce that. But the only way you can do that is lift people out of poverty and to create meaningful work for people to become self-reliant. In the meantime, you have breadwinners, income earners, taking care of extended families who are unemployed. And so the unemployment and poverty issue impacts directly on wage earners and the amount of money that they take home. And so the policy instrument of the two-pot withdrawal is a fine example of how government has tried to balance those things. It's not the preferred choice, let me be very clear, because I'm personally advocating a resistance to people to withdraw from their retirement money to fund current costs, especially if that current cost is for discretionary income, for a holiday or another car or a bigger house. If it's for paying your education or for medical expenses, yes, and even more importantly, if it is for, investing in something that will have enduring value, then I would encourage that. And so the 1/3, 2/3 policy instrumentation is one of trying to find that fine-tune and balance. But I think there's also an opportunity, and I know that there's ongoing discussion between all of the players in what other policy instruments it needs to be made. There's, for example, the onshore-offshore, Regulation 28. How much money, and local asset managers are saying if you make that too easy, then more money will flow offshore. Well, the flip side of that is if you're competitive as you need to be, then money will not flow offshore. So there's accountability on both sides. If you think of the collective investment schemes.
I want to home in on that.
The collective investment schemes. I understand, having been in the industry and run a large financial services company, I understand that the purpose of collective investment schemes is to maximize the value for the individual saver, and therefore it requires the trading or the buying and selling and movement between different investment instruments if it brings overall growth and covers the liquidity requirements that are required, balancing that with a long-term savings pool. And so I think that is an ongoing debate, and I encourage industry to continue to engage with the policymakers to find a sensible middle ground. The problem with policy instruments are often blunt and very often do not achieve the desired income, and unfortunately sometimes distributes benefit to an unintended party as opposed to the real party, which in the case of the collective investment scheme is the saver, who ultimately is the beneficiary on retirement or on withdrawal.
I want to tag onto that, Commissioner, because some say there isn't a fundamental problem with the existing legislation in that case, right? And better policing would actually achieve a better outcome at the end of the day. They're suggesting that the industry be given more time to share data, enhance that data sharing capabilities with SARS to filter legitimate short-term investment activities and, And only if the gains cannot be linked to legitimate trading activities should those then be deemed revenue in nature. Are you open to conversations like that? Are you open to that kind of suggestion?
Well, firstly, that's not my decision ultimately. But yes, I would encourage ongoing debate, and I would encourage both business and policymakers to remain open to all possibilities so the ultimate intended outcome is achieved, which is a better return for the saver and a better management of the fiscal risk on the part of government. I don't think we have found a Goldilocks solution yet, and so I would encourage, as I speak to my colleagues in Treasury in the Tax Policy Division, I encourage ongoing debate on the part of Treasury and ongoing openness on the part of business. I would say continue to provide more evidence, more data, because ultimately we both want the same thing. Less abuse and more benefit, and the benefit be directed to where it's intended.
Yeah, because while that's one triggering debate at the moment, another that's raging is still around the potential wealth tax. Why is that not more than just an easy way to fill the coffers?
Well, I think on the same principle of elasticity, that simply by increasing rates, you don't increase the revenue collection. You know, you have to understand the behavior of people. Once you've decided you want to reduce your tax burden as an individual, you will continue to arrange your affairs in ways that will achieve that. And none are more capable of doing that than wealthy people. Poor people have nowhere to go. They pay their taxes, nowhere to hide. Most of them are just salaried. Wealthy people can arrange, legitimately so, can arrange their affairs in ways that reduces their overall tax. And that's what they will do. The second thing you don't want to necessarily send a signal out is that you are targeting wealthy people, because that would also not be good. South Africa is a wonderful haven for European and other retirees to come and find a home here, to bring their money here, to come and spend it here. We have to remain friendly towards that kind of inward movement of flows of capital and people. So for me, we have advocated that better administration of the tax affairs of wealthy people is likely to have a better dividend than simply targeting and singling out and adjusting or fiddling with rates.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's never a binary choice, and ministers of finance and policymakers will continue to keep that instrument open and available. But again, for me, the message as it relates to domestic resource mobilization in this regard is to say improve the efficiency of the administration and collect the money that's already due before we raise taxes to collect more money.
Because otherwise it's simply seen as government increased tax revenue from an ever-shrinking tax base. Where does South Africa sit on the Laffer curve right now? And to what extent are you pricing in the risk of any adjustment higher, resulting in less revenue, putting larger public spending requirements at risk further down the line?
Well, I think, as mentioned before, and as the experience of the VAT increase has showed us, and our current understanding of the dynamics of the compliance landscape, it's very clear that we have reached that point of inflection, where an increase in rates is more likely to have an adverse effect on the overall compliance culture and therefore directly on the ability of SARS to collect its revenue. SARS has made significant strides in its modernization using artificial intelligence, using expanded use of data sets, both domestic and international data sets. And for example, when you heard us announce last year that we had collected the 1.741 trillion, 260 billion of that was directly linked to administrative efforts. And in that, there was about 94 billion that was collected with the help of AI modeling of debt propensity, and a further 95 or thereabouts billion of fraud risk detection AI that have helped us identify impermissible or fraudulent refunds and have prevented it from flowing out. So that's why my beating the drum for an appropriate investment in SARS is because not only do I have a conviction, we have the experience of making this investment into the transformation of the administrative platform of SARS can have substantive improvement to the revenue that we collect and ultimately to a sustainable, positively trending fiscal integrity.
Yeah, adding to that and the building up of that muscle, right? South Africa is enforcing a 15% global minimum corporate tax rate. We're moving towards the system of fairer tax administration for multinationals operating in a country, no matter where they operate or structure their businesses at the end of the day. How much of a game changer do you see something like that being, Commissioner, in strengthening the country's fiscal position? And we know that this is a global trend. This is not just a South Africa story.
Sure, and it's part of the inclusive framework that is being negotiated. Look, the battle is far from won. So there has to be broader adoption of this for it to really work. Otherwise, it's again an arbitrage opportunity and creates more favorable tax jurisdictions than others if you don't implement it. So for the system to remain equitable and fair, we should encourage broad adoption across the developed and developing world. If we don't have that, the developing countries are more likely to lose out again because invariably many of the developing countries do not have the capacity to administer even the policy that it adopts. So for me, the global minimum tax, you asked if it's a game changer. The first thing is it's a principle of greater equity because, again, unfortunately, tax policy always plays catch up. So there's a few moving parts. The first is increasingly there is a digression between physical presence, which was the traditional nexus of taxing rights, and economic presence. So why should a company, simply because its head office is in one jurisdiction, but it's economically present around the world, why should all the taxing rights accrue to that particular country where it happens to be domiciled? And so I think the inclusive framework seeks to address some of that by changing the nexus from physical presence to economic presence. The global minimum tax says companies like that, but also other multinational companies who are able to arrange their affairs in a way that they pay significantly below the statutory rate, whatever the rate may be. The global minimum tax then says you can do what you need to do, but you will not pay less than the 15% in the country where you are domiciled.
Yeah.
In other words, you can't transfer price yourself out of your taxing obligations in the country where the taxing right actually resides. And I think that's good for South Africa because it then means that the abusive practices of base erosion and transfer pricing that then erode South Africa of the tax base, to some extent, that forms a bulwark or some way of retaining the revenue that's due to the fiscus. So overall, I think it's an equitable but also a helpful measure.
Does it mean that it reduces the country's reliance on other forms of taxation, whether we're looking at personal income tax or other indirect taxes?
Well, I mean, if you look in the public documents of the budget that's submitted to Treasury, they have penciled in 8 billion additional revenue just from the global minimum tax. Of course, The ultimate extent to which we will collect the revenue will be, again, a function of how well can we administer it.
Yeah. But we are potentially then looking at a windfall coming in there. So talking windfall events, and you've talked two-pot system already, the thinking logical, right? And you've alluded to this, you've spelt it out quite clearly there. Create a system that balances immediate financial needs with long-term retirement planning. You reduce the risk of retirees depleting their funds permanently or prematurely. Talk us through the expectations versus actual impact so far, and some of the key learnings you've learned through this entire process, because it was an unexpected event of sorts.
So it depends which lens you look through to see whether it's the windfall, a good news or bad news. So we when some of the initial modeling was done, we thought that the revenue contribution would be somewhere between 5 and 6. Other commentators and modelers was about there or thereabouts. What we have seen to date, this is as of close of business on Friday, we have already had a withdrawal by 2.357 billion retirees, or not retirees, withdrawers. And the revenue amount, or the withdrawal amount, just short of 43 billion. And the tax that we've then withheld on that is just short of 11 billion. In addition, we have, as is in the rules of the withdrawal, said we will first keep any of the tax that you owe to SARS. We will withhold that as well. And we've issued directives for just short of R1 billion of debt to be collected. So overall, there is a higher than assumed contribution to the fiscus. We think probably about double what we thought. So if you say 5 to 6, we probably will end up closer to 11 or 12 billion rand to the fiscus. But it's also 12 billion rand, not 12 billion rand, 43 billion rand that will no longer grow and add to the future pool of savings. And also 43 billion that has helped current expenditure. If people were buying disposable goods, they were paying VAT on that, or sin taxes if they're buying, if they were sinning. So it has swings and roundabouts. Overall, I think it has, from a revenue contribution perspective, performed better than what we thought. Unfortunately, not enough to restore some of the negative trends and the headwinds that we faced in the first 3 quarters of the year.
Yeah, I ask about those two events because, one wonders what some of the challenges are with events that cannot be anticipated. And I know we're talking windfall here in both instances, whether you're looking at the tax on multinationals, whether you're looking at the two-pot system. But what burden does that place on SARS as you manage this, considering what you've just touched on, the fact that you've got short-term versus health of long-term savings?
Well, again, to the extent that, so by the way, the double minimum tax will only be from the 25-26 year. So that doesn't affect the current year. For us, let me first say, if you talk about the effort that we had to invest to get the system ready for a world-class and seamless withdrawal, right, wasn't part of our project and certainly was not part of our budget for the fiscal year that we are in. When Parliament made the decision that it will be implemented from October, we really had to pull out all the stops to help educate taxpayers on what the implications are. We had to build a system that could turn around a directive within literally a day, so that people, once they submitted once the fund submitted the directives, there was a response immediately. And so we had to build an automated system that could deal with this. That's one single policy change has an immediate impact on the work we have to do. Very often unseen and unappreciated by many. But if it doesn't work, then everyone obviously is alert and alive to that, as they should be. Thankfully, the system has worked, and we've literally processed, as I said, over 2.6 million applications and approved almost 3.4 of that. So every time there's a policy change, there's a potential burden on SARS to invest more technology, to use more of our people time and effort, some of our already limited financial resources to make that work. In terms of the second term, this trade-off between long-term and so again, we have a happy event by having 11 billion to the fiscus. We have a happy event by having 43 billion spent in the economy, has a nice impact on domestic VAT. But it's a short term, it's not sustainable.
Yeah.
And so the money we have now seen can't go into the base. It's just an aberration in time, which will very soon... Look, we think that the withdrawal, based on the 1/3, 2/3, may continue, hopefully won't grow. And some of that may end up in the base continually, but at the expense of reducing the longer-term savings pool, and that is an expenditure item on government's balance sheet, because those are some of the people who will then have to join the queues if they don't have, if their savings are depleted. So that long-term, short-term trade-off, we must always remind ourselves that the gains we have now are not necessarily sustainable gains.
How much of a balance brought into the equation by the fact that we are potentially looking at the mandatory enrollment of workers, and that broadening access once again to retirement benefits and broadening that entire pool?
Look, we've taken a step towards this now. In countries where it really works, you have a few things. The first is compulsory enrollment. If you work, you will contribute. We have dilly-dallied on that for far too long. I mean, this debate of pension fund reform to improve the savings has been on the boil for at least 15 years. We finally have a compromise that gets us somewhere there. But the companies where it has worked, and in fact not just improve the savings rate, but inadvertently also reduce the borrowing requirement from offshore if you have a local savings pool. So the benefit is incalculable and enduring if we can have a large savings pool of domestic resources. The second aspect is you have to have compulsory preservation. When you exit, you can't resign just to get hold of your money. And for too long, South Africans were able to do that. And in fact, resigned in the worst possible of circumstances and time and remained unemployed because they wanted the short-term relief and access to their pension fund money. So compulsory preservation is an important principle. And then the third is withdrawal for limited use. And countries where, I think of Singapore, for example, they allow withdrawal largely for buying a property and for buying investment instruments, shares on the stock exchange, because they want people to also become literate to what's happening in the economy and have a stake in the economy more broadly. And so we've taken a hybrid step towards that by the two-pot system.
Yeah. As government tries to broaden this pool, though, Edward, what about increased tax incentives to actually encourage more South Africans to save for retirement at the end of the day? What are some of the levers out there that still can be pulled?
Look, tax incentives is not a good way to change behavior. Because tax instruments generally are, as I said, are blunt instruments to change behavior. If that were the case, you'd think every year when the sin taxes go up, then people will drink less. We haven't seen that happening, have we? But areas where tax incentives can be effective is, for example, to encourage people to buy homes by giving some tax relief on the payment towards a bond. And I'm now speaking of what happens elsewhere in the world, where there are countries that make that a deduction, tax liability.
Yeah.
The certain constituents would argue, well, then it's just the wealthy people who can afford to buy homes that'll get the benefit of it again. And to some extent that is true. You'll remember many years ago, the incentive on buying a car was open-ended. And so some people could buy a very wealthy sports car and get the tax deduction. And those who could only afford a little, starter pack had less benefit. And so it was capped. So you can buy whatever car you want to, but the tax deduction was limited. So I think there are policy instruments, and I am a strong advocate that we could incentivize more the acquiring of property and certain investments. So we already have the tax-free savings. I think over time we could consider reviewing the limitations to that at the moment. And again, the argument will be, but then the wealthy people get more of the benefit. And I think sometimes we must give up on that. And so often we punish the middle, those caught in the middle, because we're trying to manage, the abuse by the other end. And I know that's provocative, but I think encouraging savings, we can have a look at things like the tax-free savings that government is offering, but also look, at the moment, a wonderful saving instrument is retirement annuity contribution, and I would encourage everyone to make use of that to the full extent. So we already have quite a bit of incentives for people to contribute to long-term instruments, but that benefit is limited to those who can afford it and limited to those who are employed. And in a country like South Africa, we have high unemployment and high levels of income inequality and high levels of poverty. It's difficult to set long-term aspirations when you're just trying to deal, Maslow talks about our hierarchy of needs.
Absolutely.
And far too many South Africans are right on the bottom ladder of that hierarchy. They never get to the point where they can sit and self-actualize about the future.
Absolutely. As we sit now and talking about the future, we're anticipating budget 2025. We've got, despite the more positive outlook on the South African economy, despite better tax administration coming through, we're still a way off from the coffers being full enough to allow government to achieve its objectives. I know that you're very tight-lipped ahead of budget. Through today, though, we have been speaking to, the custodians of the nation's savings and investments, based on your experience sitting on both sides of the table, Edward, in the private sector and then the public sector as well. What's your advice to the private sector right now to support government's objectives so that we can leverage more of this public-private partnership and collaboration that we've started to see work effectively on some fronts more than others?
At the end of the day, all of us are invested in South Africa. Not in politics or political parties. We are invested in South Africa. And the first message is we have to stop thinking of us and them. And, us versus them. This is, therefore, a need. Those of us who are privileged, and you and I are privileged. If you have a job, you're privileged. If you have a home, you're privileged. We have to think beyond our narrow interest and think of the broader interest. And not only think of ourselves. When we think about taxation, when we think about other aspects of efficient delivery of social goods and services. The second is to become part of the solution, as we've seen in the energy sector. The minute it works, everyone benefits, and everyone forgets about who caused the problem. And so I think in every area, at the moment, unfortunately, if you think of education, it's public sector versus private sector education. If you think of healthcare, it's binary. It's private versus public. I think we have to find ways to better coexist towards some common objectives to say, how do we improve education, not just for a few who can afford it, but for all? I think for the first time, there is a genuine willingness and readiness in government and the policymakers towards public-private participation. The NDP diagnostic actually calls out one of the reasons for a lack of progress, the inability of partners. And I think we've demonstrated that that can work. I would express the hope, firstly, that government remains on this track to extend itself, embrace private sector. And yes, private sector have their own interests that they will pursue, and you can't be denied that. But to find a higher level of coincidence of common interest, because at the end of the day, you can either build higher walls to protect yourself from your hungry neighbors and just make sure they're not hungry. And I think we need a mind shift. South Africa has also become very politics-centered. Every morning we wake up and say, what do the politicians do? I think we should place more responsibility and accountability on ourselves to solve the challenges that's causing the restlessness amongst those who do not have. Poverty, unemployment, and inequality harm all of us. And we have nowhere else where I would rather go. This is home. So let's make home work, but not for some of us, for all of us.
Let's leave it there, Commissioner.